we could talk about what should have been done differently, what could have been done differently, and more importantly, what we should do differently in the next pandemic, because we know there will be one. But that's not what they were interested in doing in this hearing. And so for those of us who have been in healthcare and public health, watching someone who we know has really truly lived a life of service be treated
Mhm.
this way, it's like, what is anyone's motivation to keep showing up to do this work? Hey there, fellow nerds. Welcome to another episode of The Present Illness, the podcast where two physicians try to make sense of a world that's a little febrile with all sorts of infectious diseases proliferating. I'm Arga Gonzalez, a surgeon scientist and your friendly neighborhood doom scroller in residence.
Yeah, America has more infectious diseases than I knew it could have at one time.
That's right.
I'm Alyssa Burgard, an anesthesiologist and bioethicist who tracks news and health law like their EKGs, full of spikes and surprises. The Present Illness is where we dig into public health, politics, culture, and ethics with a scalpel in one hand and a meme in the other. As a note to our listeners, we often talk about tough topics that can be intense and can be a lot, and so if you need to take a break, we totally get it.
We want to give a big thank you to everyone who's listening wherever you have found us, with some extra love to our subscribers and followers on any of the platforms. We also want to give a special warm welcome to anyone who's just stumbling in from the Senate committee that decided that Anthony Fauci should be held in contempt for using his constitutional right to plead the Fifth when he was called to testify last week in front of the Senate committee.
Did you see him and Rand Paul basically duke it out verbally at the beginning?
I did a little bit. What I really thought was noticeable for whatever reason to me was when Rand Paul was yelling at his lawyer, at Fauci's lawyer. So Fauci, for those who catch it, Fauci made a statement at the beginning that was his only comment for the day. And he basically said, I have testified many times. I am happy to have served in this role. I have nothing new to say. And I fear that I'm going to be persecuted here. And so I'm going to invoke my constitutional right to the Fifth Amendment. And so that's pretty much, that's the gist of it, you know? And then at some point, his lawyer is trying to explain it because, of course, Rand Paul and the Republicans on the committee wanted him to say things that they could then use for either clickbait or rage bait or fundraising or whatever, or to incriminate him. And they weren't getting that because he was very calmly just saying that he was invoking his Fifth Amendment right. And so the lawyer at one point is trying to explain this because Rand Paul, and even this is true for the vote they took today, that saying that he should be held in contempt. Rand Paul's argument is that he doesn't have a right to plead the Fifth because he was previously pardoned by Joe Biden. But the reality is, of course, that the pardon is only for things that happened prior to that day, right? So they were trying to get Fauci in some kind of gotcha, and who knows what the gotcha would have been. But Fauci very wisely said, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna play this game. I've already testified. He's not hiding anything. I want to be clear for our listeners. He's not hiding anything. He's testified at length about what happened in the early days of the pandemic, but he doesn't want to get prosecuted. He's 85 years old. He has lived a life of service, and he deserves to retire in peace instead of being brought back for this circus that he refused to be a part of. So anyway, at one point, his lawyer is explaining he absolutely does have the right to invoke the Fifth. And Rand Paul just says repeatedly, I'm not recognizing you. Shut up. I'm not recognizing you. You have no right to speak. If you speak again, I'm going to have you escorted out. And sure enough, he asked security to remove the lawyer from the hearing.
Talk about political theater.
Absolutely. It's theater. And I think what's hard for a lot of folks who work in healthcare or in public health is, whatever mistakes have been made, right? Like when managing a pandemic with a novel virus, it's not going to always be right? That cannot be a reasonable expectation that we have of people, of our public health leaders. And so, sure, we could talk about what should have been done differently, what could have been done differently, and more importantly, what we should do differently in the next pandemic, because we know there will be one. But that's not what they were interested in doing in this hearing. And so for those of us who have been in healthcare and public health, watching someone who we know has really truly lived a life of service be treated this way, it's like, what is anyone's motivation to keep showing up to do this work? if this is how one of our very best is being treated. I mean, this man has helped, like, he created basically PEPFAR, which has saved millions of lives. He's worked on HIV, he's worked on MERS, he's worked on Ebola, and yes, he worked on the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID. But like, what more could a person have done in service of his country? And then they want to parade him about like this political theater, as you said, to make a show of whatever. But it's like they're making a show of all of us. I mean, I think a lot of us feel it very personally.
Yeah, and I will say having you saw some shit during COVID. I saw some shit during the height of COVID. Obviously COVID hasn't gone away. People are still getting sick with COVID, although thankfully not dying at the rates that they were before, thanks largely due to vaccination. But it's been very stressful having this the politicization of COVID kind of ripped back into the headlines. I have had a bit of a hard time seeing that.
Mhm.
I did watch some of the hearings, but it was too long and awful. But it was also really telling to me to watch Rand Paul, who is technically a physician. He was an ophthalmologist. Um, and watch him say, honestly, some of the dumbest shit I've ever fucking heard to Anthony Fauci. And like, listen, there have been in a life of service, you're gonna make some mistakes, right? Like you're gonna make the best call you can make at the time. Um, you know, even when you think back to the AIDS crisis, like people have a lot to say about how much delay there was, for example, and all of that. And so I think each time there's a public health crisis, like there are going to be things like you said that we have to learn and that we have to do better in the future. And watching especially people from the Republican Party to try to relitigate all this COVID political nonsense. Because I remember when this it first got declared a public emergency, and in the early days of March 2020, I thought this is either going to be something that's going to really pull this country together, or it's going to really fuck it up.
Mhm.
And I think we figured out which one it was going to. I think we figured it out.
Well, and it's interesting because if we had had different leadership, and I don't mean public health leadership, but if we had had a different president, we'd had a different,
Uh-huh.
overall federal administration, I think that might not have been the case, right? It could have been handled very differently. It could have been, rather than trying to downplay, saying it's going to be gone by the summer, saying you should inject bleach and all those wacky things that the president was saying,
That
like,
people died
yeah,
specifically from,
yeah, like
you know.
it could have been handled from a non-public health, just from like the federal government perspective. I think it
Uh-huh.
could have been handled in a way that might have brought people together more than it did. And I will say, I think for a lot of people, because I've been posting about this a lot this week, and I see the comments, and there's a lot of gratitude. People are really
Uh-huh.
grateful for the work that people like you and I did during that time. And it's actually been moving for me to see, because
Uh-huh.
in the spaces that you and I both occupy, especially online, and there's so much vitriol and there's so much hate being slung at physicians and nurses and public health workers. And because people have been led to believe things that are not true about us.
Uh-huh.
But it's really been really heartening to see that actually a lot of people value the work that we did and continue to do and are grateful. And even though those other voices may most of the time be louder, there are a lot of people who are quietly supportive and grateful, even this many years later. So it's been really nice to see that.
That's great. I have not been online nearly as much in the last week or so, just because I was traveling. But that's good to hear because I've been a little like, do I want to go look? Um, so I'm glad to hear that that's been your experience.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to one of my videos that I made about something else we're going to talk about today, which is RFK Jr. And people can you can see it for yourself. You can see there's a lot of thank you, and I remember. I mean, that's the other piece, is like people
Yeah,
remember. We were
yeah,
all there. People remember what it was like, and people remember the uncertainty and the fear, and um all of us doing the best that we could.
Absolutely. I was just thinking my youngest kid was in kindergarten when the lockdown started. We did like Zoom kindergarten,
Hmm.
and I got to, he just graduated from his elementary school back just a couple months ago, and I remember being like, wow, these kids all learned how to read.
Hmm.
They all made it. They all made it. They're all like socially functional and like nice kids. And obviously a challenging time for people who are parents, in addition to people, everybody in our whole society was dealing with
Yeah.
unprecedented, doesn't even begin to
Hmm.
categorize it. One of the things that really struck me as well, in addition to watching Rand Paul be like just so embarrassed, I just was embarrassed. I was like, wow, look at you go, buddy. Look at you go. Wow. But also, like, why is it that I can read Anthony Fauci's, like, all of his emails and I can read, like, his diary, but I still haven't seen a bunch of people, like, actual humans, testify about the Epstein files? I still haven't seen all the documentation for the Epstein files. Like, I mean, come on, guys. Like, I don't actually care about Anthony Fauci's diary.
No, I don't either. And it's interesting because I wasn't gonna, yeah, I wasn't planning to talk about his diaries, but one of the things that people are kind of vilifying him for is that he was like excited to meet Julia Roberts and he was excited to talk to Barbara Streisand, and people are
I'd
like,
be freaking excited too.
me too.
National
I was like,
treasures.
what do you mean? It's his personal like notes. He was supposed to like be chill in his notes. But are you upset that he's like cringe in his notes, that he like thought it was really cool that
That
people.
were for himself.
Yeah, I mean, that was weird to me because I was like, he is a human being. Like, let me be clear. If I kept a diary and I were meeting all sorts of really cool people who I had admired for a long time, I would be writing about it in my personal notes, okay? And it wouldn't mean that like my work was irrelevant. I mean, it's just so weird the things that people get fixated on. Anyway,
Well, did
but
you see the like Fox News clips of where they were like Anthony Fauci's diaries? The way they would, in Anthony Fauci's diaries, like, calm down, girls.
I did not. I try to avoid all of that. But I did want to say on this note about the Epstein files, because we had another set of hearings happening, which is Todd Blanche's confirmation hearing. Then I won't
Sorry.
go a long time because I know we have other stuff to talk about, but he has been the acting attorney general ever since Pam Bondi was fired. And he is, Trump is asking that he be confirmed as the permanent attorney general. Last week, it was looking like that wasn't going to happen because Tillis and Thune were holdouts. In particular, those two were holdouts on the Republican side, saying that they did not want, they wanted to know that the IRS exemption from audit clause was going to go away. And they wanted to know that the fund that had been supposedly established
right.
that was going to pay people like
The slush
January
fund.
insurrectionists and stuff. Yeah, exactly. The people who had supposedly like that the government supposedly had weaponized against them, whatever. That fund, they wanted to make sure that fund was not going to be there. And they were not getting those reassurances from Todd Blanche. And it came up in that hearing, this question about the Epstein files, because Todd Blanche, even when Pam Bondi was the attorney general, she has stated that he was the one really in charge of the files. He was the one, right, who met with Ghislaine Maxwell. He
For
was
9 hours.
Yes, he was the one in charge of the release of the files, meaning that all that information that we talked about in a previous episode, that was that personal information about survivors that was released, that was his responsibility. So I believe it was Tillis who was very concerned about that and asked Todd Blanche if he had met with the survivors, and he had not. And so Blanche committed to meeting with the survivors, which he apparently did that day. And then the survivors, I think we talked about this, survivors were not satisfied with that visit. But not only that, so what I found out since we last recorded was that Tillis also said that he would meet with the survivors, and they showed up and waited 45 minutes, and then he never came to meet with them. And now, as of this week, both Tillis and Thune seem to be fine with moving forward with this nomination, mainly because Todd Blanche wrote some hokey thing that is totally non-binding, where he kind of seems to acquiesce to their requests, even though most logical people think that's just for show because it's, again, non-binding. So anyway, I don't think we've got the final vote yet on that. But that's
Although,
happening. The other note, real quick, on the Todd Blanche situation is that he has affirmed in kind of more private audio that was recorded and leaked his strong interest in making sure that pregnant people in this country cannot access abortion.
mhm.
And he said this in multiple different ways, but basically saying that he doesn't want states to have the right to do what they want, right? So the whole argument before was states should do whatever they want to do, whatever they think is right. And seems very intent on making sure that's not the case, that the federal government will override the states and make sure that women and other pregnant people, anybody who's pregnant, cannot access abortion. So that's what's happening with that.
And just because when we talked about the Blanche hearings, we also talked about Erica Schwartz's hearings and how she very naively apparently doesn't believe that Trump will ever ask her to lie. But she's been confirmed.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that means Jay Bhattacharya won't continue to be like the shadow boss. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't
Anyway,
know. All we can do is hope that she carries herself with integrity. I don't know. Hope for the best.
one can hope. One can hope. So, we've been talking about COVID re-litigation. So you and I thought that we could talk about RFK's epic meltdown when he was on CNN's show, The State of the Union, where Dana Bash interviewed him. And I will say, it was Hot Mess Express start to finish.
He is the biggest clown in the clown car of the apocalypse.
I'm telling you, the clown car, I think we should launch it into space like that SpaceX thing that just crashed into the moon. I mean, maybe it'll make it to Mars, maybe it won't. Send them out.
I think they would be the best possible people to explore space. I mean, I would love to hear their insights from Mars. Yeah.
If we could export all the terrible public health management that we've had recently out of the planet, out of the atmosphere, that'd be fine.
Yeah, in the name of space exploration, because we
Sure.
need that since the Earth is like literally on fire. But back to RFK Jr. So yeah, RFK Jr. does this long interview with Dana Bash, and I think there's lots to talk about, but we're going to try to focus on a couple of things. So first I'll play this clip.
The measles cases in the U.S. just reached a 35-year high. The second record-breaking year in a row, 93% of these cases are among the unvaccinated. The outbreak has happened on your watch. And even before becoming HHS secretary for years, you have been one of the leading voices questioning the efficacy of vaccines. Do you accept some responsibility for this measles outbreak?
Absolutely not. First of all, this is an international outbreak. So, and we're doing better at handling it than any country in the world. Mexico has 15 times the amount of measles per capita that we have. Canada has 4 times the amount of measles. England has 2 times the amount of measles. Did I cause those measles outbreaks?
You're the most famous.
Did I cause 137,000 cases?
You're the most famous vaccine skeptic on the planet.
Let me tell you, because actually Anthony Fauci in his diaries answers the question about why we're having a measles outbreak right now. Reason we're having a measles outbreak because of the COVID lockdowns, because people didn't, like children during that period, did not get vaccinated. And in his diaries, he says this is going to cause massive outbreaks of measles and more children, he says, this are going to die. Let me finish, because you could accuse me of something. Now, let me.
No, I didn't. I asked you a question.
Yeah, let me give you the answer. He says in his diaries, more children are going to die from measles because of these lockdowns than COVID. So if you want to know, and that age group that should have gotten the MMR when they're 18 months and didn't get it, they're the ones being infected. The people in it.
And just, God, it makes my brain hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that she asked that question directly. Do you accept responsibility for your role? Because let's remember, when this started last year, that outbreak in Texas, people were begging him to tell the public to get their children vaccinated. And what he did was emphasize vitamin A. He eventually did, in some written piece, say, kind of snuck in there somewhere, like, yes, the vaccine is effective. But he didn't, listen, a typical secretary of HHS would have been on the news saying, Folks, the reason your children are vulnerable to measles is because they're not vaccinated. The vaccine is extraordinarily effective and it's very safe. Please get your children vaccinated, right? Imagine if that had happened instead. But he, again, really pushed this vitamin A. And in fact, there were people in Texas who got sick from overdoses of vitamin A because of what he said. And in the meantime, they did not get vaccinated and they continued to get sick and a couple of people died.
Yep.
Okay. So that's one thing. And he wants to blame these, say that he's not responsible for the other countries, but yes, he is. I mean, he went to, years ago, right? He went to American Samoa specifically to convince them to stop vaccinating children. We've talked about this before. And thousands of people got measles and many children died because he convinced them to stop vaccinating. So he absolutely is responsible, at least in part, for all of this in Mexico, in Canada, and here. And he's the current HHS secretary here. He has a responsibility to tell people how best to avoid these kinds of illnesses. And she eventually, right, she drags it out of him in this interview where she's like, okay, but we know that the measles vaccine is safe and effective. Will you recommend people to get it? And he goes, oh, I've done that. She goes, no, I'm asking you right now, right here, will you recommend it? And so he does say,
I mean,
eventually,
but I watched it and it's like, he eventually says it, but it's like he really didn't want to.
clearly.
Oh, he did not want to.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say that I find the entire thing is just, it's full of like lies and assholery and him yelling at her and it's ridiculous. But like when he's like, well, did I send it to Mexico? Like, yeah, you did. Okay. Because the place in Mexico that has the highest rates of measles are in Chihuahua, and those are the ones that border Texas.
Mhm.
And we know that folks who were from that Gaines area in Texas who traveled to Chihuahua, Mexico, and then they took the measles with them. So actually, yes, RFK Jr., I do blame you for the largest measles outbreak that Mexico has seen. Actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mexico has, as soon as it started, really pushed for people to get vaccinated and has had a huge impact in preventing that outbreak from being significantly worse.
Yeah. And he, in this country, we've had the most number of cases this year that we've had since 1991. That's not just because some people were delayed in getting vaccinated because for a few months in the pandemic, they couldn't get into their pediatrician's office. I do think that absolutely was a real thing that we thought about and talked about at the beginning of the pandemic, was what's going to happen to that kind of elective care, that routine care that people would get when initially, we didn't really know what was going to happen. So a lot of offices were closed and it was harder to get in for non-emergency things. We were all very aware of that. It's not just Dr. Fauci. Like, that was a thing that was talked about in medicine. And certainly missed doses there are problematic, but they're not in Texas specifically, right? Or, in the Carolinas. Like that, those specific locations are places where there are people who had chosen not to vaccinate their children.
Yeah.
And if it were an issue of, oh, people just missed doses during the pandemic, then wouldn't we see the same number of cases everywhere, as opposed to these pockets where, again, there's just fewer people who are vaccinated, so they're below the threshold, and so it's more likely for the virus to spread.
Additionally, it's looking at the data on the ages of kids. So it's one thing if kids didn't get vaccinated in 2020 and 2021 and even 2022. And, we haven't successfully caught back up with those kids. But the reality is that when you look at the data, about 20% of the cases this year alone have been in kids under 5, but 50% have been in kids who are 5 to 19. And so you can't have it both ways. He has been pushing this anti-vaccine rhetoric for decades.
Absolutely. I think that goes against this idea that it was all just very young children who missed a dose or two during spring of 2020.
Yeah.
Okay. Another clip I wanted to play from this interview is one that really upset a lot of people, including me. And so let's listen to that.
Lockdowns were done by governors. I mean, certainly Anthony Fauci and the president had opinions, but the lockdowns were done by governors, and largely because they were hearing from hospitals saying that their ICUs were overrun and they needed some help while that was happening.
Well, that's not true. That's just not true.
It is
What
true.
you're saying is not true. No, they were doing it because Anthony Fauci was telling them from the top, you need to lock down. There were ICUs that were empty all over the country, including in New York at the height.
I'm asking you, I'm going to go back to what I asked you at the beginning.
I was in New York City in the spring of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And I was serving in an ICU that was a makeshift unit in what normally was a PACU, or post anesthesia care unit. The pre-op unit, which was right close to us, again, because I was in the PACU, pre-op and PACU usually close together, that also was an ICU. There were multiple units across this hospital, this large hospital that I was at in New York, that had been converted to ICUs because there were not enough existing ICU beds. And that is what was happening all over New York City. I also later in 2020 and in 2021 helped with ICU care for COVID patients in Arizona, where similarly multiple units across this also very large hospital had been converted to ICUs to be able to have enough beds to care for patients who were sick, specifically with COVID. So for him to say that ICUs all over the country were empty, that basically we were all exaggerating, or that our lived experiences weren't real, or that we're lying. I mean, like, what is it he's really trying to say, right? Because I was there. A lot of us were there. And a lot of people also lost loved ones. And while I was the one sitting there with my gown and my gloves and my shield and my mask, holding my personal cell phone up to your sister, aunt, wife, husband's face so you could say goodbye from your house because you couldn't be there, while I was holding their hand in their last moments, what was RFK Jr. doing? I can guarantee you he wasn't doing anything to help anybody else. And he dares to sit there and say, it wasn't really so bad. The ICUs were empty. We didn't need to. The reason this conversation comes up is he's blaming Fauci for supposed lockdowns. It's important to remember we didn't actually have lockdowns in this country. There was never a time when you couldn't leave your house. There was never like an enforcement of you can't leave. You know, that was not a thing that happened in this country. We had a period of time, it was actually relatively short, when some elective services, like elective surgeries, for example, and certain types of offices were closed, and then they opened back up. Schools remained virtual for a little bit longer period of time. That was out of an abundance of caution for the safety of children. But anyway, he's saying, this is the wild thing. He's suggesting that Anthony Fauci was responsible for lockdowns all over the world, right? Because like, it's not just the United States that tried to encourage folks to stay home for a while. This happened all over the world to try to minimize the spread of this contagious virus. And he's sitting there with a straight face arguing that the reason any of that happened in the United States was because of Fauci. Okay, well, who do you want to blame for that happening in Europe? Was that also Fauci? Like, do his tentacles reach the entire globe? Did he also, he also like created the bioweapon, right? So he created the bioweapon and then he made everyone stay home so they couldn't get sick with the bioweapon.
And then he talked about it in his diaries.
Yes. If you read the diaries, it's all in there. Which obviously is not, but anyway, it's so disgusting to deny the experiences of those of us who were on the front lines, and also importantly, those who lost loved ones and could not be there with them in their last days. I saw somebody just commented on one of my videos that they had lost 27 people. 27 people. And this man dares to sit there and say, oh, we didn't need to do any of that stuff. That was nonsense.
Well, and the other thing that was really, he talks about how many children were supposedly harmed by whatever the public health response. And we were so fortunate I had a lot of hard experiences doing ethics consultations for the adult hospital during COVID, because all the things that we would normally do in person, like you said, we're doing them over Zoom, we're doing them over the phone. You're like, you can't hand people tissues. Like there was all this extra sort of emotional labor. And then we were doing a lot of work on crisis standards of care. And like, I was like not sleeping as we tried to figure out like, well, what if we run out of this? And what if we run out of this? And who's gonna step up for this role or that role? I was on a volunteer list to do the kind of work that you did. Like, was I going to be deployed from the pediatric hospital to do adult work? We weren't sure. But when we think about the impact on kids, like, yeah, there was a lot of impact on their schooling. I was raising, very young kids at the time. And it wasn't like I stopped working. Like I kept going to work. And one of the most tragic things that we saw in terms of impacts on kids is that we just had so many kids who had a parent or a grandparent or somebody who was a primary caregiver, their babysitters who fucking died. And, you want to talk about long-term negative impacts on children. Like, yeah, when your parent dies or your grandparent who usually takes care of you during the day is suddenly dead, it's a big impact. And so I also get really upset when we talk about kids as though they are like this siloed entity. As opposed to the fact that like kids are an integrated part of a family. So like when you have adults dying of COVID, you have older people dying of COVID. Those are people who are really important in their communities, in the lives of their families, in these multi-generational relationships. And there was just so much that was lost.
Yeah. And I think, when you talk about crisis standards of care, I just want to explain that a little bit because we were definitely doing that when I was in New York. It was like we have one dialysis machine left. Like we had very limited. So there's a form of dialysis that's continuous. It's called CRRT, which is used when people are really, really, really sick because they can't their bodies can't tolerate the shift in fluids that happens with a single regular kind of outpatient dialysis session. So they have these special machines that dialyze continuously small volumes all day long. And there's relatively fewer of those machines available because that's not usually in normal times. Like you don't need too many of those. Yeah. Not too many people are that sick and have that kind of kidney failure. But kidney failure was something that we saw a lot in especially those early days. And so we would have like a CRT unit and we'd be like, well, maybe we can, have it with this person one day and this other person another day, which is not how that's meant to be done.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like we'd have someone who had kidney failure who couldn't get any treatment for it. And they were just potassium was going to go, like these were choices that people were really having to make. And, the number of ventilators, if somebody had just posted actually a tweet from Trump even saying that he wanted General Motors to make more ventilators because we didn't have enough ventilators. I mean, it was just a really, really difficult time to make these terrible decisions of like who is going to get access to this limited resource that could be life-saving for them. And those are the types of things that we were dealing with in the hospitals in those days. So it's just a real slap in the face for the Secretary of Health and Human Services to suggest that it really wasn't that bad and that the things we needed, that the things that were done were over the top and unnecessary, and that those things caused more harm than the virus itself.
Talk about revisionist history.
For sure. And why, right? Like, why is he doing that? Well, I think part of it for sure is to take some of the blame off of Trump. So Trump, as we talked about earlier, he completely messed up everything. I mean, his whole team, they had already gotten rid of the pandemic preparedness materials that Obama administration had put together. That had happened prior to the pandemic starting. And his constant disinformation, right? Like every day during those press conferences where he was pushing hydroxychloroquine and pushing ivermectin, things that do not work. I mean, we now have a lot of data showing that they do not.
And it would have been awesome if it worked. But then we did science and we were like, oh, it doesn't work.
Yeah. And to this day, people are still using those treatments that are totally ineffective and can cause harm on their own. Anyway, so we had all of that happening, and it's really, I mean, I understand why it's happening, but it's a stark contrast with how they're treating Dr. Fauci, who spent the whole time doing the best he could to help people, And then you have Trump, who was intentionally putting out misinformation and disinformation, has said that he didn't want people to know how bad it was. I mean, there's that excerpt or audio of him that was, I think, in one of the books, that a journalist held on to for like a year or two. Anyway,
Yeah.
where he says like he knew it was very, very serious and he purposefully downplayed it. And that's honestly, by the way, what they're accusing Fauci of, that Fauci did not do, but Trump definitely did. And they're not like, when's he going to testify? When's he going to testify about Epstein, by the way, too? But anyway, either way, still waiting. And he's not being held responsible for any of that. And so what can you do if you don't want him ever to be held responsible is you try to say it didn't happen the way that millions of us remember it happening. Try to tell us that it wasn't that bad.
The book was Bob Woodward's book.
Yeah.
Bastard.
Yeah. And he held on to that audio. And he held on to that story for the sake of his book. Anyway, that's a different problem. But yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. And then part of it is just undermining, the continuous undermining of public health. In another part of the interview, he talks about how, so Dana Bash says like, well, what about a future pandemic? Like, what have you learned? What should we do in a future pandemic? And he says something that initially is very surprising. He says, well, I think we should listen to the doctors. And I'm like, yes, but I know that's what you mean.
So when he said that, I definitely like perked up because I was like, that can't be right. He can't possibly mean, real doctors.
Yeah, because he's constantly telling us or telling people that we're lying and that we're bought by pharmaceutical companies, all this stuff. So, of course, as
putting the term experts in scare quotes.
Oh, he did. Yes, absolutely. Why are you he's asking Dana why she's bringing experts onto her show. Anyway, so he is talking about America's Frontline Doctors, which is a group of yeah, exactly. They peddled all these and continue to peddle these ineffective treatments that they can sell, right? So they're grifters. They're not following evidence-based medicine. But those are the doctors. That's what he's saying. When asked what we should do differently, he's saying we should listen to grifters who are selling ineffective treatments, because he then goes on to say that like these doctors had found these treatments that worked and we ignored them. We did not ignore them. In fact, as Alyssa was saying, there were many studies that were done, and I put multiple of them in a recent video that I did to look at like, does ivermectin help? Does hydroxychloroquine help? I mean, when I was in New York, we did convalescent plasma. We did anything, remdesivir. We did anything and everything at those early days because we really didn't know what would work and we were willing to try anything. But once we had more data, it became extremely clear that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin are not effective for treating COVID. But that's what he was implying in that segment. But he did it in such a way that you had to know what he was talking about to know what he was talking about. Because he did not mention those medications. He didn't mention that specific group. He just said frontline doctors.
And just for fun, I just think it's a great opportunity to remind people of like Dr. Simone Gold, who, for example, was one of America's frontline doctors peddling misinformation and was reprimanded by the California Medical Board for her behavior around unsupported treatments. And BTW was also one of the January 6ers.
Absolutely.
I just think that's, it's a fun fact in case people forgot.
Well, and I think it's useful to point out, because somebody said this in my comments, they were like, well, then why were they censoring all these people? And I think there's a difference between, and I think it is tricky, but like there were, for example, this person was talking about like people's accounts being banned on Twitter, which Simone's never was to my knowledge. But some people were deplatformed by different outlets, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, whatever. Because they were spreading misinformation and disinformation. And that's what this person was very upset about, like that there was like this supposed censorship. But if we think about like Jay Bhattacharya, who you mentioned, who is a person who frequently complains about censorship, that is a person who is now like very high up in our government. So he was
censor in chief now.
Yeah, correct. And it was, okay, like maybe he didn't have access to every social media platform because some of them chose that he shouldn't be allowed to spread disinformation on their platform. But it's not like he went away. He continued to go on television. He continued to write. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not like, oh, you couldn't find out about Jay Bhattacharya's views if you wanted to. And what I said to this person was like, how would you know about him if he had been so censored? Like the fact
I
that
mean,
you know who he is and that he's been elevated to this position tells you that he wasn't actually censored. He just wasn't allowed on certain platforms. But that's, and I don't know, people can have different views on that when it comes to free speech. I do think it gets really murky. But it was in the interest of public health that what were we supposed to do? I mean, and not we, like, I mean, I wasn't involved in making those decisions. Obviously, I don't run these platforms, but I think there's a real question there when we have, even now, like we've talked about this before, like with the apple cider vinegar type stuff, like the health related disinformation gets much more traction than the truth. And so there's constantly people like us who are trying to say, okay, no, actually this supplement doesn't do the thing that they're trying to tell you it does, or like baking soda doesn't actually cure cancer, or, you know, these kinds of things. But our videos never or almost never get as much traction as the original that's telling you, like, for example, that you don't need to get mammograms, or you don't need to get colonoscopies. And so
please get your mammograms and colonoscopies, people.
please. What I'm trying to just say is that I don't know what the solution there is, but I can understand the decision making at the time, which was we've got a lot of people sick and dying, and we have some people who are making that worse by pushing out disinformation. What can we do about it from a public health standpoint? And the decision was made for some of these people to not allow them to spread that on specific platforms. Those people could continue talking. They could go operate op-eds for their newspaper. I mean, they could continue to do all sorts of other things. They just maybe couldn't post on Twitter for some period of time.
But don't worry, then Elon Musk bought Twitter.
Right, because he's such a bastion of free speech that you can't say the word cis anymore on the platform. So that's working out really well. And one last thing we should talk about with this RFK Jr. interview is the misogyny that was on display. I mean, he
was aggressive.
Consistently and persistently talked over Dana Bash. There was that section that a lot of people saw where she's asking him about autism and the MMR vaccine. And he goes, well, you might not understand because you're not a scientist. And
it was so rude. I was like, shut the front door.
Yeah. And good for her, because she said, you're not either, bro. In that section, like, he goes on to yell at her. There's parts where he's telling her that journalists are the real problem.
And like her personally.
Yes. He says you. And she's like, what do you mean me? Like, anyway, I think he maybe meant generally journalists, which is a different problem. But he clearly spoke with her in an extremely disrespectful manner.
It's hard to imagine that he would have spoken that way to a man.
Exactly. And I do think that misogyny is something that unites this administration.
Truly. And, it puts her in a difficult position because in order to, she has to remain as calm as possible. She's not allowed to raise her voice because then you get called shrill, then you get called, all the things we know. And it's kind of an impossible position to be in. And a point that you brought up before we started recording is the fact that, like, this absolutely should not have been played in its entirety without being edited.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I strongly feel that anytime anyone from this administration is going to do a quote unquote live interview, that it can be taped in real time, but I think it should be taped in advance. And I think that there should be clear messaging on the screen about every single thing they say that is not true, because it is impossible for anyone, even the best journal, even if it was a scientist talking to him, it's impossible to fact check every single thing because he just spews nonsense continuously. And you'll never get anywhere if all you do is say, no, that's not true. And that's not true. And that's not true. And then the way that he was yelling at her would have gotten you.
Yes, it is. Ah,
exactly. And so I think I mean, I'm not a journalist, right? But what seems to make sense to me is you record it in advance. It can be real time without cuts if that's what you want to do. And then you give your fact checkers time to actually insert citations and accurate information on
so
top.
Hear me out. I think it's time to bring back up VH1's pop-up videos. I think that we need pop-up public health videos. VH1, let's do it.
I'm all for it.
Give it a fun little background noise and be like, bloop. That's a lie.
CNN, if you're watching, we're happy. We're happy to help provide this service.
I think it'd be great.
And
I think that we could host that show. That'd be great.
I think that's great. I love it.
Okay, there's so many things that happen. We're not going to be able to talk about all of them, but I did just want to mention after a ton of drama back in April about the FDA refusing to even consider Moderna's mRNA flu vaccine, it has now been approved. It's called Mflusiva. I don't know if that's how they're pronouncing it. It's been approved for people 50 to 64, and then there's an accelerated approval for people over 65. There will also, for people over 65, be a phase 4 effectiveness data collection period, and we will see what happens. mRNA vaccines don't take as long to prepare as traditional vaccines, and so this may actually make it so that you can actually get a more effective flu vaccine because you'll be able to develop it when you are more certain about which flu is going to come around during the year.
Yeah, no, that was great news to see. Did you want to give a Mitch McConnell update?
Oh, listen, McConnell Watch. I'm always on it. I kind of, it's one of the things that pretty much every day on the news, I'm like, do we know anything more about Mitch? Is he with us? I don't know. So he apparently, we're recording on Thursday, August 6th. He apparently was released from rehab today. So we're told. I haven't seen any photos or video. So TBD, but apparently he's been released, apparently has released a statement that he's still not quite ready to come back to vote. So for what it's worth, we were talking before about how, this is really not cool for the people of Kentucky. They deserve representation. And I still think that that's true, but I'm not going to turn down the silver lining that he just keeps not voting in things. And that means that the Republicans just don't have the votes. They don't have the votes. And I think that America can really benefit from that. So thanks, Mitch, for your service.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for helping, Mitch. All right, what else is going on? Oh, we've got these are just like little things that we're keeping an eye on and want folks to know about. So there's a couple salmonella outbreaks. Folks heard there's some eggs that have been recalled. So hopefully those are off the shelves already, but that's been going on. And then more recently, it's apparently been on the jalapenos at Chipotle. So, we continue to see the consequences of having the clown car of the apocalypse in charge, or clown car of public health, I should say, in charge. That's in addition to the Legionnaires that's happening in New York and the leprosy that's happening in Florida and the continued cyclosporiasis, by the way. We talked about Taylor Farms. I did also find out that Taylor Farms employs prison laborers, which is the modern form of slavery. So Taylor Farms is like really, really low on my list of businesses to support at this point in time. And what else? There's other things, friends. There are a lot of things happening in the public health realm. There are lots of consequences of food deregulation, unfortunately.
Yeah. Another big story that came out last week was estimates about how much taxpayers are spending to make sure that people who work at Amazon and Walmart get Medicaid benefits. And so we're constantly being told that we can't afford Medicare for all. We can't afford that. But apparently we can't afford to subsidize massive corporations that don't pay enough taxes.
Exactly. Well, and that's why sometimes when people talk about like welfare recipients, folks like Jeff Bezos, the Walt, Elon Musk, and other ways, they really are the largest recipients because the public is subsidizing, in the case of Walmart and Amazon, the public is subsidizing their employees.
So does that mean that we can use Jeff's yacht?
I saw that Zuckerberg bought a second yacht because the first one wasn't enough. But anyway, there are no ethical billionaires and we should have no billionaires. And I'm all for taxing those people to Mars. Anyway.
And again, as we were talking about the clown cars of public health, I say send them in space.
Yeah. They can build a really lovely colony on Mars. I think then their legacies would be cemented, right? They were the ones who started the Mars colony. I think that'd be great for and for us. Okay, and then do you want to talk about the deportations?
Oh man, I just it's so horrible that all of the all the immigration stories are terrible. But I was just reading a story about how there's like dozens of people who are active military service members whose spouses and children have been put in detention.
Mhm.
And in the past, there was a bipartisan agreement that those people were sort of off limits.
Mm.
And apparently the government doesn't think that anymore. And I'm going to say something that I believed for a very long time, which is that children don't belong in detention and should never be separated from their parents.
Mhm.
So, just one more way that this government just keeps stooping to be the lowest of the low.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been, as you said, no shortage of heartbreaking immigration related stories. But that is really a special way to say thank you for your service to the people who sign up to protect and defend this.
Tell me again how much you value our military. Well, and even from the point of like military readiness, like this is dumb. Like you should not, as the government, be like, you work for the government and we want you to go do our bidding. But BTW, we put your family in a cage. Like that's not a great way to get people in the military to remain loyal and to remain in service and etc. It makes me like this is just none of it is right and none of it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, none of it makes sense if you're thinking about the country, but I'm sure it all makes sense if you're thinking about the money that you're getting from contractors, that you're paying to contractors who are your friends, and that they're then giving you gifts on the backside because this whole administration is extraordinarily corrupt, and we're not going to have time to talk about like the Capital One seizures of his bank accounts because they were suspicious for money laundering. Basically, I mean, there's so much on the financial fraud side of things happening with this administration. But on that note, shall we talk about something good?
Yes. Oh, we need a palate cleanser. Take 2, call me in the morning. What is giving you joy this week, Argvon? Lay it on me.
I found a very cool creator who I think does lots of things, but I came across this person because she cosplays the Earth. And so, like you mentioned earlier, the fact that SpaceX had some equipment that collided with the moon,
crashed and made a huge crater. Mm-hmm.
The way I knew that was happening was from this creator, because she had a video where she was talking to, she had one video where she was like calling SpaceX to be like, hey, like just, looking out for my moon, and then another video later where she's talking to the moon and the moon is like, oh, I look so bad now. Anyway, she's really funny. And she also does a lot of like, just general like sciencey stuff about like the Earth talking to the sun. Anyway, it's cute and funny. And, the way that she does it is, I don't know if anybody ever saw the Lemon account or if you saw the Lemon account, but like there's a specific like special effect that lets you put your eyes and your mouth on an object. So that's how she does it. Like her eyes and her mouth on a little picture of the Earth.
Got it.
And she's like, so in one of the videos, she's asking the moon, like, did they actually come land on the moon in 1969? And they have like a little argument about it, but she's like, but why would they go there? Like, you don't have any of the things that I have. Why would they go to the moon? Anyway, so I'll put a link to one of her videos in the show notes. How about you? What's your to?
I don't know why the algorithm served this to me, but it was delicious. Jacob's Food Diaries is basically, it's like an overhead camera of someone preparing food, and the food is prepared to look like something. And so all of the videos start with basically like a customer ordering something to eat and then the creator responding. And so the one that came to my attention was, I'll have the chicken roast with a side of drama. And it says, me, say less. And the entire thing is she builds a chicken with like mashed potatoes are the base, and she like sort of uses the mashed potatoes to sort of sculpt this chicken shape. And then she puts like a piece of roast chicken in it to like be the neck and head of the chicken. And then she does all this wild stuff to decorate it. And then because it's with a side of drama, the chicken has this like weird expression on its face made of like carrots and other things. And then At the end, it ends with like just a bunch of gravy being dumped over the entire scene, and it's just very funny. And so she's got other ones that are like dinosaurs and people and Simpsons characters, and food creativity on display.
I love that. I also like in general seem to really like various food videos. I saw somebody making a focaccia yesterday. I was like, I should make a focaccia. Why not? Seems so
Yum.
easy.
It actually is pretty easy to make focaccia. I highly recommend.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. I have a recipe I've been eyeing for a while. Anyway, one of these days I will make it. But yeah, I think that's it for this week's episode. If you didn't like what you heard, this has been the Grand Old Podcast. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to The Present Illness, leave us a review, and tell your friends.
Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at The Present Illness, and stay on top of all of our TPI-related news.
We will be back next week with more headlines, hot takes, and doom scrolling, hopefully wrapped in some laughs.
Until then, agitate, hydrate, take a nap, and we'll see you next time on The Present Illness. Production by Argavon Salas and Alyssa Burgart. Editing by Alyssa Burgart. Social media by Argavon Salas. Original music by Joseph Uphoff. Don't take medical advice from random people on a podcast. The show's for informational purposes. It's meant to be fun, and it's certainly not meant to be medical advice. So please take your medical questions to a qualified professional. This podcast is our hobby, and it does not represent the opinions of our employers or anyone but ourselves.